The smell of metal polish hangs in cold air. Somewhere in Geneva, in a workshop lit by winter afternoon light, a small brass wheel turns under a jeweler's loupe. The tick is almost silent, softer than breathing. Welcome to Timekeepers for Sleep. Tonight's story begins not with a watch, but with two men who should never have met. One was a soldier who learned to survive when his country disappeared from maps. The other was a village watchmaker's son who dreamed of eliminating the small brass key that everyone kept losing. Their names were Antoni and Adrien, and the watches they would make together would carry a comma between their surnames for more than a century. You don't need to remember the dates. You don't need to memorize the facts. You can simply rest here in the dim light of 1839 Geneva, where the smell of watchmaker's oil mixes with smoke from a dozen chimneys, and let this story wash over you like rain. By the time we're done tonight, you might be asleep. That's perfectly fine. The story will continue without you, gentle and patient, asking nothing except that you rest. If you like stories like this, you can always return to Timekeepers for Sleep whenever you want to fall asleep with the quiet company of watches and clocks. For now, all you have to do is get comfortable. Find a position that feels easy for your body. Let your shoulders rest where they fall. Let your hands land wherever they want to land. There is nowhere else you need to be. Let's begin with Antoni, though that wasn't always his name. In 1812, in a small manor house near Lublin in Poland, a boy was born into a world that was already changing faster than anyone could control. His family bore the Prodzik coat of arms. They owned land. They had history stretching back through generations of Polish nobility, the kind of history written in family portraits and estate boundaries and wedding contracts. But history, as Antoni would learn by the age of 18, can be taken away as easily as a pocket watch slipping through torn fabric. By the time he was 10, his father had died. The family moved to Warsaw. Antoni, still a child, watched his mother manage what remained of their estate, watched her navigate a world where Poland existed only as an administrative region of larger empires. Russia to the east, Prussia to the west, Austria to the south. Poland, the country his ancestors had fought for, had been carved up and divided like a meal between neighbors who had never asked permission. By 16, Antoni was a soldier. Not because he wanted glory, not because he sought adventure, but because in 1830, when you were young and Polish and the Russian Empire was tightening its grip on what remained of your country, there weren't many choices. You could accept the occupation quietly, go about your life, pretend that having a foreign czar as your king was perfectly normal. Or you could fight. Antoni chose to fight. The November Uprising began on a cold night in Warsaw, November 29, 1830. Picture it if you can, though you don't have to hold the image clearly. Just let it drift through your mind like a half-remembered dream. Young cadets, barely older than schoolboys, breaking into arsenals. Voices echoing off cobblestones. The metallic click of musket locks being tested. The smell of gunpowder and winter air. Antoni was there. Not leading, not commanding, just present. A second lieutenant in the 1st Mounted Rifles Regiment, doing what young men do when their country asks them to stand between hope and occupation. The fighting lasted months. Not the dramatic kind you see in paintings, with flags waving and cavalry charging in perfect formation, but the grinding, muddy, inch-by-inch kind where you learn how little the body needs to keep going. Cold mornings that started before dawn. Long marches through countryside that looked the same in every direction. Brief moments of actual combat followed by hours of waiting, wondering if you'd survive to see another sunrise. Antoni was wounded. Twice. Once in the shoulder, the musket ball tearing through muscle and lodging against bone. Once in the leg, a blade that cut deep enough to make walking difficult for weeks. Neither wound was romantic. Just torn flesh, infection risk, long nights in field hospitals wondering if you'd walk properly again, wondering if the fever burning through your body would break or consume you. For his service, for the times he stood his ground when others ran, for the wounds he carried, they gave him Poland's highest honor, the Virtuti Militari, a golden cross that meant you had shown valor in the face of something larger than yourself. But crosses don't stop armies. By September 1831, the uprising had failed. Warsaw fell. The Russian forces rolled back in, heavier than before, more determined to crush any future resistance. And suddenly, being a decorated Polish officer meant you were marked. Your name was on lists. Your face was known. If you stayed, you faced imprisonment at best, execution at worst. Antoni, along with thousands of others, had two options: stay and face retribution or walk. He walked. Imagine leaving your country not because you want adventure, but because the alternative is a cell or worse. You pack what you can carry. Perhaps a change of clothes, some bread, whatever money you've managed to hide. The golden cross they gave you for bravery, tucked into an inside pocket because it's the only proof you have that you fought for something real. Then you start walking. Antoni crossed into Prussia first, joining the stream of Polish exiles heading west. They called it the Great Emigration, this wave of soldiers, intellectuals, minor nobility, poets, artists, anyone who had supported the uprising and now had nowhere to go. Prussia didn't want them. They were trouble, potential revolutionaries, men who had proven they would fight empires. So Prussia pushed them further west, toward France. Paris in the early 1830s was full of Polish exiles. They gathered in certain cafes, recognizable by their accents, their threadbare military coats, the way they looked at maps of Poland as if staring hard enough could redraw the borders. They wrote pamphlets arguing about what went wrong, what could have been done differently. They formed committees and societies with grand names, all dedicated to the dream of someday, somehow, restoring an independent Poland. But dreams don't pay rent. Antoni needed work. He tried to study painting under a Swiss teacher named Alexander Calame who was living in Paris at the time. Antoni had some talent, enough to sketch landscapes, enough to capture the likeness of a friend's face, but not enough to make a living. So he pivoted the way survivors do. He started trading wine and spirits, buying low from vineyard contacts, selling higher to merchants and restaurants. Learning the rhythms of commerce, the way money flows through a city, the art of negotiation. Money came in. Not a fortune, but enough to live on, enough to send a little back to other Polish exiles who had nothing. Antoni became known in the Polish community as someone reliable. Someone who had fought, been wounded, decorated, and now was making his way in the world without complaining about how unfair it all was. Then, around 1834, the situation changed. The French government, under diplomatic pressure from Russia, decided that hosting so many Polish rebels was politically inconvenient. They didn't arrest anyone. They were more subtle than that. They simply made it clear that France was no longer a welcoming place for Polish political exiles. Antoni received word, politely but firmly, that he should consider relocating. So he moved again. This time to Geneva. Switzerland was neutral. Switzerland didn't care about Russian diplomatic pressure. Switzerland just wanted to make watches and stay out of other people's wars. It seemed like a good place to disappear. If you've never been to Geneva, or if you've only seen it in modern photographs, try to picture it as it was in 1834. Not yet the city of international organizations and banking towers and luxury watch boutiques lining every street. Just a small, tightly wound republic sitting at the southwestern tip of a long lake, surrounded by mountains, surviving on precision. Geneva had been making watches for nearly 300 years by the time Antoni arrived. It started, as many things do, with an accident of history. In the 1500s, a religious reformer named John Calvin established himself in Geneva and began imposing strict rules on daily life. No dancing, no theater, no jewelry. Jewelry, Calvin declared, was too ostentatious, too worldly, too much about showing off wealth rather than focusing on God. The goldsmiths and jewelers, suddenly out of work, looked at their tools, their steady hands, their ability to work with tiny precious things and asked themselves, what can we make that isn't jewelry? Watches, someone suggested. Watches weren't jewelry. They were scientific instruments, tools for measuring time. Calvin had no objection to measuring time. So Geneva became a city of watchmakers. By the 1600s, French Huguenots, Protestant watchmakers fleeing religious persecution in France, arrived in Geneva bringing their skills and secrets. The industry grew. By the 1700s, Geneva was exporting thousands of watches every year to clients across Europe. And by the time Antoni arrived in 1834, the city had developed a unique system of production. They called the master craftsmen cabinotiers, named after the small workshops or cabinets where they worked. These weren't large factories. They were small rooms, usually on the top floors of buildings in the Saint-Gervais district, the old part of Geneva on the left bank of the Rhône River. Why the top floors? Light. Watchmaking requires incredible precision. You're working with parts smaller than a grain of rice. Screws that you can barely see with the naked eye. Springs so thin they're almost invisible. You need light. As much natural light as possible. So the cabinotiers climbed to the attics, installed rows of windows that almost touched each other, creating these long bright workspaces under the eaves. If you walked through Saint-Gervais in 1834, you would see these buildings. Tall, narrow, with the top floor glowing in the afternoon sun as dozens of windows caught the light. Inside those rooms, men hunched over wooden benches, magnifying loupes pressed to their eyes, hands steady as surgeons, assembling watches one tiny component at a time. The workshops were quiet. Not silent, but quiet in a particular way. You would hear the soft tick of movements being tested, the scrape of a file against brass, the click of tweezers picking up a jewel, occasional murmured conversation between master and apprentice, and underneath it all, a kind of hydraulic hum. By the 1830s, many Geneva workshops were powered by water pressure from the city's hydraulic system. Pipes ran through the buildings, feeding water to small turbines that powered lathes and polishing wheels. Every morning, the cabinotiers would open their water taps, and the machines would start turning. Every evening, they would close them, almost all at the same moment, creating a pressure surge that the city's engineers had learned to anticipate and manage. Time in Geneva wasn't just measured. It was manufactured. It was the rhythm of the entire city. Antoni arrived in Geneva with very little. Some money from wine trading, a network of Polish exile contacts, the clothes on his back, and a gold cross pinned inside his coat that represented a warhead lost. He rented a room in Versowix, a small commune just outside Geneva proper, staying with a family named Moreau. The Moreaus were kind to him. They didn't ask too many questions about Poland, about the uprising, about the scars on his shoulder. They simply offered him a room, invited him to dinner, treated him like a person rather than a refugee. It was at their table that Antoni met Marie Adelaide Elizabeth Denizart, daughter of a French tradesman. She was quiet, practical, with an intelligence that showed itself in the questions she didn't ask. She seemed to understand that some men carry their past in silence. They were married in July 1839 in Versowix, in a small ceremony attended by Polish exiles and Swiss neighbors who barely understood each other but shared wine and wished the couple well. But before that wedding, Antoni had already begun his third career. He started visiting the workshops of Geneva. Not as a customer. He couldn't afford the watches they made. But as an observer, someone curious about how things worked, how an entire city could organize itself around objects the size of your palm. He watched the cabinotiers work. He learned the vocabulary: balance wheel, escapement, jewel bearing, mainspring, crown wheel. He had no formal training as a watchmaker. But he had an eye for quality, and he understood something the Geneva workshops hadn't fully exploited: decoration. The watches being made in Geneva were mechanically excellent. Accurate, reliable, well constructed. But the cases were often plain. Brass or silver, maybe some simple engraving, but nothing that told a story. What if, Antoni thought, you could make a watch case that carried meaning? What if you could engrave a portrait of a national hero? A family coat of arms? A scene from history? For the Polish exile community, these wouldn't just be watches. They would be portable pieces of identity, of memory, of a country that no longer existed on any official map. Antoni started small. He bought movements from Geneva's established makers. Just the mechanism without cases. Then he commissioned jewelers and engravers to create decorated cases. A watch with the image of Tadeusz Kosciuszko, the Polish general who fought for American independence. A dial with the Poniatowski coat of arms. A case back engraved with a scene from Polish history. He sold these watches to the Polish community in Paris, in Geneva, anywhere Poles had settled. And they sold. Because these weren't just timepieces. They were acts of resistance. Small, quiet, portable declarations that Poland still existed, at least in the hearts of those who carried these watches. Around the same time Antoni was learning the watch trade, another exile was working in Geneva. His name was Franciszek Patek, though in Geneva he went by François. Born in Bohemia, raised in Poland, he too had fled after the November Uprising. But unlike Antoni, François was a trained watchmaker. He knew movements from the inside. He understood the geometry of gears, the mathematics of gear ratios, the delicate relationship between a balance wheel and its hairspring. Antoni had the business sense. François had the technical skill. On May 1, 1839, they signed a formal partnership agreement and created a company, Patek, Philippe & C. The name was printed on the dials of their first watches, separated by a comma, as was customary for business partnerships. They set up a small workshop and employed other Polish exiles, Wawrzyniec Gostkowski, Wincenty Gostkowski, the Ladisław Banderski. The workshop became a kind of haven, a place where displaced men could earn money and maintain dignity through skilled work. The watches they produced were excellent. Thin pocket watches with hand-engraved cases, enamel dials painted with extraordinary detail, lever escapements that kept time within a few seconds per day. Their reputation grew quickly. Not just among Poles, but among Swiss collectors who appreciated the artistry. But Antoni and François were not the same kind of men. Antoni was restless, always traveling, always looking for the next client, the next market, the next opportunity. He saw the watch business as something that could expand internationally. François was cautious, perfectionist, more interested in making the best possible watch than in making the most watches. He wanted to control every detail, refine every process. Over 6 years the friction grew. Small disagreements about money, about which clients to pursue, about whether to expand or maintain current production levels. By 1844 it was clear the partnership couldn't continue. They dissolved the company politely without scandal, each going their separate way. François went on to start his own firm, Philippe & C., which would eventually make watches for Napoleon III and build its own respected reputation. Antoni looked for a new partner, someone who could bring technical innovation. Someone who thought the way he did about the future of watchmaking. While Antoni was building his business in Geneva, a young man in rural France was solving a problem that had annoyed watchmakers for 200 years. His name was Adrien Philippe. Born in 1815 in a village called La Bazouki-Gouet, deep in the French countryside, he was the son of a country watchmaker who made clocks with complex, original movements. Adrien grew up in a house where the sound of ticking was as constant as the smell of bread baking. His father's workshop was full of tools, parts, half-finished mechanisms spread across workbenches. As a child, Adrien would watch his father work for hours, filing a pinion, adjusting a spring, testing the beat of an escapement. By the time he was a teenager, Adrien could disassemble and reassemble a clock movement blindfolded. Not because anyone asked him to, but because had done it so many times the movements lived in his hands. At 18 he decided to see the world. He traveled through France, stopping in different cities to work with different masters. Lyon, where he learned about silk guild regulations. Paris, where he saw the latest innovations from the city's best workshops. He crossed into Switzerland, worked briefly in Geneva, then moved to England where he saw the beginnings of industrial production methods applied to watchmaking. Everywhere he went, he absorbed techniques, asked questions, made notes in small journals he carried with him. By 1842, settled back in Paris and running a small workshop with a Swiss partner, Adrien had become obsessed with a specific problem: the key. Every pocket watch at that time required a small brass key to wind the mainspring and set the hands. The key was a separate object. You carried it in your pocket or on a chain or in a special compartment in your watch case. To wind your watch, you would open the back of the case, insert the key onto the square arbor of the fusee or barrel, turn it carefully, counting the turns, feeling the spring tighten, remove the key and close the case. To set the time, you would open the front bezel, insert the key onto the square boss of the minute hand, turn it to move both hands, remove the key and close the bezel. The system worked. It had worked for centuries. But keys got lost. They fell out of pockets. They were left on tables and cafes. Sometimes they were the wrong size for a particular watch. Sometimes the square hole in the key would wear smooth, and suddenly you couldn't wind your watch anymore. Adrien thought, what if the key was built into the watch? What if there was a small crown on the side of the case, attached to a stem that went into the movement, and you could turn that crown to wind the spring? And what if, by pulling the crown out slightly, you could shift internal gears to set the hands using that same crown? The idea was simple. The execution was not. Inside a watch, space is measured in fractions of a millimeter. Every wheel, every pinion, every jeweled bearing has to fit in a volume no larger than a coin. There's no room for waste. Every component serves a precise function. Adrien's challenge was to create a mechanism that could switch between two modes, winding and setting, using a single crown. His solution was elegant. He designed what became known as the sliding pinion. Imagine a small gear, circular, made of brass, with teeth cut around its edge. In the center of this gear is a square hole. This gear slides along a square section of the winding stem, the shaft that connects the crown to the movement. Because the hole is square and the stem is square, when you turn the crown, the gear must turn with it. They're locked together rotationally. But the gear can also slide back and forth along the stem like a bead on a wire. In its normal position, resting closer to the movement, the gear engages with the winding mechanism. Its teeth mesh with another gear called the crown wheel, which connects to the barrel that holds the mainspring. Turn the crown and you wind the watch. But when you pull the crown outward, a small lever inside the watch pushes the sliding pinion along the stem, moving it away from the winding mechanism. As it slides, it disengages from the crown wheel and engages instead with a different set of gears, the hand-setting train. Now turning the crown moves the hands. Push the crown back in, and the pinion slides back to its original position. Back to winding mode. The entire mechanism fit inside the existing footprint of a pocket watch movement. No additional bulk. No external levers or buttons. Just a crown that you could pull and push and turn. Adrien called it a more simple, solid, and convenient system than has ever existed before. He was right. By 1844, he had refined the design and built several working prototypes. In 1844, Paris hosted the Industrial Exposition, a grand exhibition of new inventions, machines, and manufactured goods. It was the kind of event where engineers and merchants and inventors came to show the world what was possible. Steam engines that could power entire factories. Textile looms that could weave complex patterns automatically. Printing presses that could produce thousands of pages per hour. And in one modest corner at a small booth, Adrien Philippe exhibited his keyless winding mechanism. There wasn't a flashy display. Just a pocket watch opened up to show the internal mechanism. a placard explaining the innovation. A few watches assembled to demonstrate that the system actually worked. Judges walked through the exhibition, examining hundreds of entries. When they came to Adrien's booth, they stopped. They asked him to demonstrate. He pulled the crown, set the time, pushed it back in, wound the watch. They asked technical questions. How did he prevent the stem from backing out? What about dust entering through the crown? Could the mechanism withstand years of daily use? Adrien answered patiently, showing them the seals, the threading, the materials had chosen. The judges conferred among themselves, made notes, moved on. Later, when the awards were announced, Adrien Philippe received a bronze medal. Not gold, not the highest honor, but enough to catch attention. Among the thousands of visitors walking through the exhibition halls, past steam engines and textile machinery and scientific instruments, was Antoni Patek. He was in Paris on business, looking for new ideas, new suppliers, anything that might give his watches an edge in an increasingly competitive market. When he saw Adrien's display, he stopped. He picked up one of the demonstration watches, pulled the crown, set the time. Want it? Then he asked questions. How reliable was it? How many prototypes had been tested? How long had they been in use? What about manufacturing cost? Could the system be adapted for different types of movements? Adrien answered each question clearly, precisely, without exaggeration. Antoni made a decision. He introduced himself, explained that he ran a watch company in Geneva, said that he was looking for a technical partner, someone who could bring innovation to their production. Would Adrien consider moving to Geneva? Adrien said he would think about it. A few months later, Adrien received a letter at his Paris workshop. The handwriting was clear, the tone businesslike but warm. Monsieur Philippe, I hope this letter finds you well and that your work continues to prosper. Since our meeting in Paris, I have been thinking about your keyless winding system and its potential to transform watchmaking. I would like to invite you to Geneva to discuss a partnership. I believe that together we could create watches of exceptional quality and innovation. If you arrive by night, go to the Hotel du Lac and say to the landlady that I have recommended you. Adrien, take care of your health, come quickly and I will shake your hand. Your devoted servant, Antoni Patek. It wasn't a formal contract. It was an invitation to join something that was still taking shape. Adrien thought about it for several weeks. Paris was familiar. He had contacts there, a small workshop, a reputation. Geneva was unknown. He spoke French, so language wouldn't be a problem, but it meant uprooting everything. But the opportunity was clear. Antoni had business connections, markets, clients. What he needed was technical innovation. Adrien had technical innovation but lacked the business infrastructure to scale it. Together they could build something neither could achieve alone. In early 1845, Adrien Philippe packed his tools, his journals, his carefully wrapped keyless winding prototypes, and traveled to Geneva. On May 15, 1845, Adrien Philippe became head watchmaker at Patek & C. The partnership agreement was signed by three men, Antoni Patek, Adrien Philippe, and Vincent Gostkowski, a fellow Polish exile who provided additional capital. Adrien's initial role was technical director. His job was to integrate his keyless winding system into the movements they were already producing and to develop new mechanisms that would distinguish their watches from competitors. He set up a small development workshop within the larger production space. Here he built prototypes, tested variations, refined his designs. The first keyless winding movements came out slowly. Each one was essentially handmade, with parts filed and fitted individually. But as Adrien developed jigs and fixtures and templates, production became more consistent. By late 1845, they were producing several keyless winding watches per month. The response from clients was immediate. People loved not having to carry a separate key. They loved being able to set the time quickly, discreetly, without opening the watch case. The mechanism became a selling point, a feature that justified higher prices. But Adrien didn't stop there. He started developing other innovations. A slipping spring at the end of the mainspring that prevented overwinding damage. A compensation balance that adjusted for temperature changes, improving timekeeping accuracy. New designs for index assemblies that made regulation easier and more precise. Jointed winding stems that were easier to assemble and less likely to break. Each innovation was small on its own, but together they made Patek and C watches more reliable, more accurate, more elegant than most competitors. Antoni saw what was happening and made another decision. In 1851 he made Adrien a full partner. The company's name changed officially to Patek Philippe and C. The comma remained, that small punctuation mark separating two surnames that would become inseparable. That same year, London hosted the Great Exhibition, the first international exposition of its kind. A massive glass and iron structure was built in Hyde Park, nicknamed the Crystal Palace, to house exhibits from around the world. Over 6 million people would visit during the months it was open. Patek Philippe and C sent several watches, including examples of their keyless winding system. The watches were displayed in the Swiss section, alongside products from other Geneva manufacturers. Among the visitors who walked through the exhibition halls was Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. She stopped at the Swiss section. She examined several watches, asking questions about their construction, their accuracy, their decoration. When she saw the keyless winding mechanism demonstrated, she was intrigued. She purchased a pendant watch, delicate and small, decorated with diamonds set in blue enamel, fitted with Philippe's keyless winding system. It was a small transaction. One watch. But the symbolism was enormous. When the Queen of England buys your watch, newspapers notice. When society figures learn that Victoria chose Patek Philippe, they want to know why. Suddenly, Patek Philippe wasn't just another Geneva workshop making good watches. It was the company that made watches for royalty. From that point forward, their reputation expanded beyond the Polish exile community, beyond Geneva collectors, into the broader world of European and eventually global haute horlogerie. Let's step inside now into an ordinary day at the Patek Philippe workshop in the early 1850s. You arrive before dawn when the streets of Geneva are still mostly empty. The workshop building sits on a narrow street, stone walls, tall windows on the upper floors. You climb the stairs to the third floor where the assembly benches are set up. The room is cold. It's winter and Geneva winters are sharp. There's a small iron stove in the corner, but it's not lit yet. You light it first thing, feeding it coal, waiting for the warmth to spread through the room. While the room warms, you light your oil lamp and set it on your bench. The light is still dim, the sun not yet up, but the lamp gives enough illumination to prepare your workspace. Your tools are exactly where you left them last night. Tweezers arranged by size, screwdrivers with tips finer than needles, a set of files so small they look like toys, a jeweler's loop on a small stand. On the bench is a movement, partially assembled. You've been working on this piece for 3 days now, fitting each component carefully, checking each pivot for smoothness, ensuring each gear meshes without binding. Today you need to install the balance wheel. You pick it up with tweezers, holding it by the rim, careful not to touch the delicate hairspring coiled beneath it. The balance wheel is a tiny brass circle with 4 curved arms, each arm carefully polished and balanced so that the wheel spins true. At the center is a jeweled bearing, a tiny ruby with a hole so small you can barely see it. You position the balance wheel over the movement, aligning the pivots with their jewel bearings. Lower it slowly, very slowly. If you go too fast, if your hand trembles even slightly, the pivots can bend or break. Lower. The tip of the upper pivot touches its jewel. Lower. The lower pivot seats into its bearing. The balance wheel is in place. You exhale slowly, realizing you've been holding your breath. Now you need to attach the hairspring stud to the regulator. This is delicate work. The hairspring is so thin it's almost invisible, a flat spiral of steel barely thicker than a human hair. You use a specialized tool to grip the outer coil without bending it. Thread it through the stud. Tighten the tiny screw that holds it. Test the beat. You give the balance wheel a tiny push with a piece of pegwood. It begins to swing back and forth. Tick, pause, tick, pause. The rhythm is steady, even. Good. You set the movement aside and pick up another one. Around you, other watchmakers are arriving, lighting their lamps, opening their tool drawers, beginning their own work. Someone is fitting hairsprings. Someone else is decorating bridges with perlage, using a rotating brush to create tiny overlapping circles on the brass surface. Another person is assembling dials, pressing tiny hands onto pinions, making sure they clear each other by the width of a hair. No one is rushing. Rushing breaks things. Rushing creates errors that can't be fixed, so you work at the speed the watch demands. Steady, patient, present. The morning passes. The sun rises, filling the workshop with natural light that makes the lamp unnecessary. You blow it out, saving oil for later. By midday, you finished 3 movements. Each one now ticks steadily, waiting for cases, waiting to become complete watches. You take a break, eating bread and cheese at your bench, drinking water from a tin cup. Then you return to work. The afternoon passes the same way as the morning. Slow, careful, precise. By evening, when the sun begins to set and you light your lamp again, you've completed 5 movements. A good day's work. You clean your bench, put your tools away exactly where they belong, and descend the stairs into the cold Geneva evening. Tomorrow you'll do it again. And the next day. And the day after that. This is not factory work. This is not mass production. This is handcraft, one watch at a time, each piece made as well as human skill can make it. This is the rhythm that built Patek Philippe. While Adrien stayed in Geneva perfecting movements, Antoni traveled. He went to England, to Russia, to the United States, to Germany, to Italy. Everywhere he went, he carried sample watches, catalogs, letters of introduction. He visited trade fairs, met with collectors, showed the latest work from their Geneva workshop. In America in the 1850s, Antoni discovered a market hungry for precision. Americans were building railroads across vast distances. They were standardizing time zones, creating networks of telegraph communication that required accurate timekeeping. They loved the idea of a watch that didn't need a key, a watch you could operate with one hand while consulting papers with the other. Antoni sold watches to railroad executives, to businessmen, to anyone who needed to know exactly what time it was in a country where precision was becoming essential. He also recognized that Americans wanted stories. They wanted to know who made the watch, where it came from, what made it special. So Antoni told them about Geneva, about the cabinotiers, about Adrien Philippe's invention. He made each watch feel like more than a tool. It was a piece of Swiss precision, a connection to European craftsmanship, a symbol of sophistication. When he returned to Geneva, he brought new orders, new ideas, new challenges. The partnership worked because each man did what he did best. Antoni sold the vision. Adrien built the reality. But Antoni never forgot where he came from. Throughout his life in Geneva, he remained deeply connected to the Polish exile community. He hired Polish workers whenever he could, giving jobs to refugees who had no other prospects. He donated money to Polish causes, the Polish Democratic Society, the Polish School in Paris, charitable funds for widows and orphans of the uprising. In 1863, when Poland rose up once again against Russian occupation in what became known as the January Uprising, Antoni sent 10,000 francs, a significant sum, to support the effort. He knew it probably wouldn't succeed. Had fought in one failed uprising already. But he sent the money anyway because some things matter more than practical outcomes. Some of the watches he produced carried hidden symbols. Polish eagles engraved on case backs. Portraits of national heroes like Tadeusz Kosciuszko decorating dials. Religious imagery that had specific meaning to Polish Catholics. These weren't just decorations. They were acts of quiet defiance. They said, "We are still here. We still remember. Poland may not exist on official maps, but it exists in our hearts, in our work, in these small perfect mechanisms that will outlive empires." By the 1870s, both Antoni and Adrien were aging. Antoni's health had never been robust. The old wounds from the November Uprising, the years of travel, the stress of building and managing a business, all took their toll. He developed anemia, felt weaker with each passing year. In 1875, recognizing that he needed to plan for succession, he brought in 3 employees as co-owners, Singria, Rouge, and Cone. His son, Lyon, was only 20 years old and showed no interest in watchmaking. Lyon wanted a different life, one without the constant pressure of building and maintaining a business. Antoni didn't force him. He arranged an annuity, a guaranteed income, and let his son live as he chose. On March 1, 1877, Antoni Patek died in Geneva at the age of 65. He was buried in the Cimetière de Châtelaine, a quiet cemetery overlooking the city where he had spent the second half of his life. The watches carried his name forward. Adrien Philippe continued running the technical side of the company for another decade and a half. He trained his sons in the business, developed new complications, continued to push the boundaries of what was possible in mechanical watchmaking. In 1891, at the age of 76, he handed control to his youngest son, Joseph-Émile Philippe, and a partner, François-Antoine Conti. Adrien Philippe died in January 1894, 50 years after Head first demonstrated his keyless winding mechanism in Paris. The company he and Antoni built kept going. For more than a century, the name appeared on dials with that small comma. Patek, Philippe, and C. 2 exiles, separated by a punctuation mark, united by a vision of what a watch could be. In 1932, during the global economic crisis, the company faced financial difficulties. The Stern family, who had been dial suppliers to Patek Philippe for decades, stepped in as buyers. Charles and Jean Stern became the new owners, keeping the name, keeping the standards, keeping the commitment to hand-finished excellence. They didn't try to change what Patek Philippe meant. They protected it. Today, the Stern family still owns the company. Thierry Stern, the 4th generation, runs it now, maintaining the same philosophy. Make fewer watches, make them better, never compromise on quality. In 2009, they made one small change. They removed the comma. Now it's just Patek Philippe, 2 names flowing into each other as if they were always one word. But the history remains written in old dials, in museum archives, in the story of 2 men who left their countries and built something that would outlast them. If you walk through Geneva today, you can still see the Saint-Gervais district, the tall buildings with rows of windows where the cabinotiers worked. Some of those workshops are still there, though most have been converted to apartments and offices. The Patek Philippe Museum, opened in 2001, sits in the Plain-Palais district. Inside, you can see watches dating back to the 16th century, including pieces from the earliest days of Patek, Zapec, and C. You can see pocket watch number 87, signed Patek, Zapec, and C, with Antoni's personal mark. You can see examples of Philippe's keyless winding mechanism, the sliding pinion preserved under glass, still functional after 175 years. The building is quiet, temperature-controlled, filled with soft light. It's the kind of place where people whisper without being told to, where you can spend hours looking at tiny mechanisms and feel time stretch and slow. Let's return now to that mechanism, the invention that brought 2 lives together. Imagine holding one of those early Patek Philippe pocket watches, made in the 1850s. The case is gold, smooth, slightly warm from resting in your palm. You find the crown, a small knurled button on the side. You turn it slowly, feeling the resistance as the mainspring wins. Click, click, click. 30 turns, maybe 40, until you feel the spring is tight. Then, without any additional tool, you pull the crown out one small notch. You can feel the mechanism shift inside, the sliding pinion moving along the stem, engaging with different gears. Now you turn the crown again and the hands move. Forward, backward, precise. You set the time, push the crown back in, and hear the faint click as it locks into place. No key, no fumbling, no lost parts. Just a watch that does what it should, simply, elegantly, without asking anything you can't provide. This is what Adrien Philippe invented. This is what Antoni Patek brought to the world. Since 1839, Patek Philippe has never stopped making watches. Not during wars. Not during economic collapse. Not during the quartz crisis of the 1970s when mechanical watches seemed obsolete. The company persisted because it understood something fundamental. A watch is not just a machine. It's a relationship between a person and time. When you wind a watch, you're participating in a ritual that hasn't changed in 2 centuries. You're connecting to the same gestures that Antoni and Adrien performed when they tested their first keyless movements. You're joining a line that stretches back through exiles and inventors, through wars and migrations, through small workshops lit by oil lamps in a city built on precision. You can rest now with this knowledge. Somewhere in the world, a Patek Philippe watch is ticking. Maybe in a vault, maybe on a wrist, maybe in a drawer forgotten for decades, waiting to be wound. Its balance wheel swings back and forth, 288,000 times a day, each swing perfectly equal to the last. The watch doesn't know who made it. It doesn't remember the hands that assembled it, the eyes that inspected it, the journey it took from Geneva to wherever it rests now. It just keeps time. And that, in the end, is all it needs to do. Let your attention now drift back to your own body. You're not in Geneva. You're not in 1839. You're here in your own time, in your own place. Notice the weight of your head on the pillow. Notice how your shoulders have dropped slightly since this story began. You don't need to force anything. Your breath has its own rhythm, like a balance wheel swinging. Pause. Pause. Each cycle the same length as the one before, not because you're controlling it, but because that's what breath does when you stop interfering. If you're still awake, that's fine. If you're drifting, that's fine too. There's no correct way to listen to this story. In a workshop in Geneva 200 years ago, a watchmaker might spend an entire day on a single component. Not because he was slow, but because the component demanded that much care. You can't rush the filing of a pivot. You can't hurry the adjustment of a hairspring. The watch will tell you when it's ready. Right now, your only task is to do what those watchmakers did. Be present with what's in front of you. Accept what's in front of you is rest. And rest doesn't need to be earned, deserved, or justified. It just needs to be allowed. Imagine one last time that Geneva workshop. The sun has set. The cabinotiers have blown out their lamps, closed their tool drawers, and descended the narrow stairs to the street below. The workshop is empty now, but not silent. On a dozen workbenches, movements sit half-assembled, waiting for tomorrow. And if you listen very carefully, you might hear the faint tick of one watch, left running overnight to test its rate. Tick, pause, tick, pause. The sound gets quieter as you move away down the stairs, out into the cold night air, until finally it's gone. This is where we leave Antoni and Adrien. Not at the end of their stories, because their stories don't really end. They continue in every watch that still carries their names, in every sliding pinion that still functions after a century and a half, in every person who winds a watch without thinking about the exile and the inventor who made that simple gesture possible. If this story has given your mind something gentle to hold, you can let it go now. The history will keep itself. The watches will keep ticking. Thanks for listening. You can sleep. Good night.